It was a bitterly cold Christmas Eve, and Officer Greg Wallace sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from a dented thermos. Snow flurries danced in the beam of his headlights, blanketing the small town in a soft white glow. Most people were home with their families, but Greg had drawn the holiday shift. He didn't mind. He wasn't much for Christmas cheer. Over the years, his once joyful memories of the season had been replaced with bitterness. His job had hardened him, and his distrust of certain people, particularly those who didn't look like him, had become second nature. As he patrolled the quiet streets, his radio crackled. Suspicious activity reported at Maple and Fifth. Possible shoplifting at the corner store. Suspect is a black female, mid-30s, carrying a large bag. Greg rolled his eyes and grabbed the radio. "I'm on it," he said, starting the engine. As he turned onto Fifth Street, he spotted a woman walking briskly down the sidewalk, clutching a worn canvas bag. Her coat was thin, and her breath formed puffs of vapor in the icy air. Greg pulled up alongside her and rolled down his window. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, his tone sharp. "Can I have a word with you?" The woman stopped, her shoulders tense. She turned slowly, her wide, frightened eyes meeting his. "Yes, officer?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We got a report about some theft in the area," Greg said, stepping out of the car. "Mind telling me what's in the bag?" The woman clutched the bag tighter against her chest. "It's just some things for my kids," she said softly. "I didn't take anything, I promise." Greg narrowed his eyes, his suspicion growing. "I'm going to need to search that bag," he said, reaching for it. The woman took a step back. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "I haven't done anything wrong." Greg's patience snapped. "Ma'am, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Put the bag down and turn around, now!" Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she reluctantly set the bag on the ground and turned around. Greg cuffed her wrists with practiced efficiency, ignoring her muffled sobs. "You're making a big mistake," she said through her tears. "I was just trying to—" "Save it!" Greg interrupted, picking up the bag. "You can explain yourself at the station." Greg drove back to the precinct in silence, the woman sitting in the back seat, her head bowed. When they arrived, he led her to a holding cell and set the bag on his desk. As he prepared to log the contents of the bag, something stopped him. For the first time that night, he noticed the woman's face, the exhaustion etched into her features, the sadness in her eyes. She didn't look like a criminal. Shaking off the thought, Greg unzipped the bag and began pulling out the items inside. The first thing he found was a small hand-knit scarf, its stitches uneven but clearly made with care. Next came a second-hand toy truck, its paint chipped but still functional. Then a pair of tiny shoes, clearly meant for a child. Greg's brow furrowed as he continued to empty the bag. Each item told a story. A threadbare coat, a box of crackers, a small stuffed bear with one button eye missing. Finally, at the bottom of the bag, he found a handwritten letter. The paper was crinkled, and the ink had smudged in places, but the words were legible. Greg hesitated before unfolding the letter. He glanced over his shoulder, ensuring no one was watching, then began to read. "Dear Santa, I know you're very busy, but if you have a little extra magic this year, could you please help my mommy? She works so hard and always makes sure I have what I need, but she's very tired. I don't need anything for Christmas. I just want my mommy to smile again. Thank you, Santa. Love, Jaden." Greg stared at the letter, his throat tightening. The neat, childlike handwriting was unmistakably sincere, and the plea was so heartbreakingly simple. He looked over at the woman sitting in the holding cell, her head resting against the wall, eyes closed as if she were trying to summon strength. His gaze returned to the items on his desk. These weren't the spoils of theft. They were humble gifts, the kind only someone with nothing could give. The worn teddy bear, the scarf, the tiny shoes, all of it spoke to a mother's desperate love for her child. Greg cleared his throat and stuffed the letter back into the bag. His hands trembled slightly as he zipped it closed and walked back to the holding cell. The woman opened her eyes as he approached, her expression wary. "Ma'am," Greg began, his voice softer than before, "can you tell me what happened tonight?" The woman sat up, her hands still cuffed. "I didn't steal anything," she said quietly. "I've been saving up for weeks, picking up odd jobs and doing what I could. I finally had enough to get a few things for my son. Nothing fancy, just something to make Christmas special." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, blinking back tears. "I guess someone saw me carrying the bag and thought the worst. But I swear, officer, I paid for everything." Greg felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. He thought of the letter, the words written by a little boy who only wanted his mother to be happy. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" he asked, his tone still guarded but less accusatory. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and defiance. "Would it have mattered?" she asked. "You'd already decided what kind of person I was." The words hit Greg like a punch to the gut. She was right. He had judged her before she had a chance to explain. For a moment, Greg stood silently, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back to his desk. He grabbed the phone and called the corner store. "This is Officer Wallace," he said. "I need to confirm a report of theft earlier this evening." The store clerk sounded puzzled. "Theft? No, there hasn't been any theft here tonight." Greg's grip tightened on the phone. "You're sure? A woman with a large bag? Nothing suspicious at all?" "Positive," the clerk replied. "I remember her. She bought some toys and snacks, paid with cash, even gave me a smile and said, 'Merry Christmas.'" Greg thanked the clerk and hung up, his jaw tightening. He had made a mistake, a big one. Returning to the holding cell, Greg pulled out his keys and unlocked the door. The woman looked up in surprise as he stepped inside and removed the cuffs from her wrists. "You're free to go," he said, his voice low. She rubbed her wrists, her expression cautious. "What about the bag?" "It's yours," Greg said, handing it back to her. "I spoke to the store. They confirmed everything. I'm sorry for what happened tonight." The woman stared at him, her shock evident. For a moment, it seemed like she might lash out, demand an explanation for his behavior. But instead, she simply took the bag and stood up. "Thank you," she said softly, her dignity intact despite everything she had endured. As she turned to leave, Greg called out, "Wait!" She paused, looking back at him. "Your son," he said, his voice hesitant. "Jaden, right?" Her eyes widened. "How do you know his name?" Greg felt a lump rise in his throat. "I read the letter," he admitted. "He sounds like a good kid." She nodded, her expression softening. "He is. He's the best thing in my life." Greg stood there, grappling with emotions he hadn't felt in years. The woman clutched the bag to her chest, her posture tense, but no longer fearful. "Wait just a moment," Greg said suddenly. He walked back to his desk, rummaging through a drawer until he found his wallet. Pulling out all the cash he had, just under $60, he returned to her. The woman's eyes narrowed. "What's this?" she asked. "For Jaden," Greg said, holding the money out. "And for you, to make Christmas a little brighter." The woman hesitated, her pride clearly warring with her need. Finally, she shook her head. "I can't accept that. You don't owe me anything." Greg's hand didn't waver. "Please, I messed up tonight. This is the least I can do." Tears filled her eyes as she reached out and took the money. "Thank you," she whispered. Greg nodded, his throat tight. "Merry Christmas," he said quietly. The woman turned and walked out of the precinct, the bag slung over her shoulder and her head held high. Greg watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and regret. The precinct grew quieter as the night wore on. Greg sat at his desk, staring at the letter he had carefully unfolded once more. Jaden's simple words echoed in his mind. I just want my mommy to smile again. He thought about his own mother, long gone now, and the sacrifices she had made for him when he was young. She had worked double shifts at a diner to make sure he had presents under the tree, even when it meant going without herself. Greg had strayed far from the values she had instilled in him. Somewhere along the way, he had allowed cynicism to take over, letting his uniform become a shield against compassion. The next morning, Christmas Day, Greg woke up with a sense of resolve. After brewing a pot of coffee, he grabbed his coat and headed out, ignoring the fresh layer of snow that blanketed the street. He didn't know much about the woman or where she lived, but he remembered the address she had listed on the arrest report. It wasn't far, just a few blocks away in one of the town's run-down neighborhoods. When he arrived, he saw a small, weathered apartment building with cracked windows and peeling paint. Greg hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. He knocked on the door of the unit listed in the report, his breath forming clouds in the frosty air. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and the woman appeared, looking startled to see him. "Officer Wallace?" she asked, clutching her coat tightly around herself. "Please, just call me Greg," he said. I wanted to stop by and see how you and Jaden are doing." The woman studied him warily, but eventually stepped aside. "Come in," she said. The apartment was small but tidy, with a modest Christmas tree in one corner. The decorations were handmade, and a few small presents sat beneath the tree. A boy, no older than 7, peeked out from behind the couch, his big brown eyes filled with curiosity. "Jaden," the woman said gently, "this is Mr. Wallace. He's a police officer." Greg knelt down, trying his best to look approachable. "Hey, Jaden," he said with a small smile. "Your mom tells me you're a pretty great kid." Jaden stepped out slowly, clutching a stuffed bear that Greg recognized from the bag. "Hi," he said shyly. Greg reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wrapped packet. "I brought you something. Merry Christmas." Jaden's eyes lit up as he took the gift, carefully unwrapping it to reveal a set of crayons and a drawing pad. "Thank you," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. The woman watched the scene unfold, her expression softening. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Greg stood, meeting her gaze. "Because I was wrong," he admitted, "and because no one should feel forgotten on Christmas." Over the next hour, Greg stayed for a cup of coffee and got to know the little family. Jaden showed him his drawings, proudly explaining each one, while his mother, who introduced herself as Angela, shared bits of their story. By the time Greg left, his heart felt lighter. As he walked back to his car, he realized that the encounter had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had started the night as a man consumed by prejudice and cynicism, but the courage and resilience of a single mother had opened his eyes to the humanity he had been missing. In the months that followed, Greg made a conscious effort to change, not just in how he approached his job, but in how he treated people. He volunteered at local shelters, advocated for better community policing practices, and even helped organize a toy drive for families in need. And every now and then he stopped by Angela and Jaden's apartment, bringing small gifts or simply checking in. They became a reminder of the power of compassion and the importance of looking beyond the surface. That Christmas, Greg had learned that true strength wasn't in authority or control. It was in kindness, understanding, and the willingness to change.